Hello everyone, I'm JG and welcome back to Music Forever, where today I'm bringing you guys a brand new catch-up review where to talk about several recently released albums and EPs from 2019 that for one reason or another I didn't have a chance to talk about in full when they initially dropped, so instead I'm talking about them here in today's video. Today I got one new album and 3 new EPs to talk about. I know it seems like a lot more EPs than usual, but I noticed recently I haven't heard as many EPs this year as, like last year, at least comparatively, as to how many I heard last year around this time of year. I haven't heard as many, so I wanted to increase that number a little bit, check out some EPs from artists I like that I didn't have a chance to hear yet, or some ones I heard some buzz about, stuff like that. So yeah, that's why I have more EPs to talk about here today, but we are actually going to start things off with the first and only studio album I have to talk about here today, the newest album from Tomb Mold, Planetary Clairvoyance. This was my first time listening to a Tomb Mold album. I have heard some very good things about this group in the past few years or so. However, I never really got around to checking them out until the release of this album, especially considering I had heard so many good things about this album. I definitely really wanted to check it out and give it some listens, considering I do like some old school death metal, which is, essentially the sound that this band does on this album, as well as their others, I believe. I have not heard their other albums yet, but after hearing this one, I'm certainly interested in doing so, considering I like this new album of theirs a fair bit. My biggest fear coming into listening to this album was that this project was just going to be a bit too typical for its own good, because a lot of, more old school style death metal that gets released nowadays, whether it be from older acts in the genre or some newer acts as well, I feel like the biggest problem it oftentimes runs into is that it's, a bit too typical, it's a bit too flat sounding and stale sounding, and it really brings nothing new to the table that's worth hearing, and instead it just makes me want to revisit the older classics in the genre that are a lot more fulfilling to listen to. However, with this new album here from Tomb Mold, that's not really the case. For a couple of reasons. One of those being that on occasion on this project, while the band is for the most part sticking to that old school death metal sound, they do throw some new, different ideas your way, just enough to keep you interested. And the other reason why I think this album manages to work is because this band has a lot of energy and charisma when, performing on this album. I just get the feeling that these guys are really into what they're doing here. All the performances on this thing are really energetic and visceral sounding, which for a death metal album is what it should sound like, and I'm really happy to say that these guys definitely pull it off nicely, even though the sound of most of this thing is, rooted in sounds that have been around for a good few decades at this point. The band still manages to pull them off rather nicely. The opening track to this album, Beg for Life, is probably my favorite song on the entire project, starting out as this more straightforward, aggressive death metal track, which had a lot of those very energetic, nasty, and visceral qualities I mentioned previously. However, a good way into this track's runtime, it decides to switch things up a bit more with regards to the instrumental and give you this more acoustic sounding instrumental as opposed to the really aggressive, in-your-face death metal guitars and drums and bass. This new instrumental the track switches over to is one that sounds very different, but at the same time manages to maintain the very dark, atmospheric sound that I feel like the rest of the track had to some extent. Not only that, but the death growls that are laid over this very beautiful, ominous sounding instrumental makes for a really strange but intriguing combination of sounds. Overall, I think this mashup of ideas works out really nicely, and like I said, this song ends up being one of the highlights on the album, and it really demonstrates what I mentioned previously when it came to the highlights with this project as a whole. The band's able to stick to that really classic death metal sound and pull it off well, but at the same time they're able to twist things just enough to keep you interested. The track Phosphorine Ultimate is another one of the more interesting cuts on this thing, essentially being this atmospheric instrumental cut in the middle of the album. I feel like it can almost be classified as an interlude of sorts with how it connects the previous song and the next one. However, I feel like this song is long enough and there's enough going on in it to really make it its own thing still. And I like the change of pace that it brings to the album. I wouldn't say that this track is necessarily like breaking new ground or anything, or one of the more interesting twists in metal in recent years or anything like that, but for what it sets out to do, I think it accomplishes it nicely enough. It's a nice change of pace, and it's a nice breather moment on this project. Aside from this song, some of the other tracks that appear earlier on in the track list, like the title track for example, or Infinite Resurrection, are among some of the other highlights on this project, really just embodying what I like about this album's take on death metal. Really straightforward, aggressive, a nice production sound, everything sounds very visceral and grimy and nasty, and it just excels at this style of music pretty much, even if it is a style that has been around for a while, like I said before. I do think that some of the songs that come later on in this album, towards the back in like the last 3 tracks for example, do get to be a bit more typical than I would like necessarily from the genre. While the sound of these tracks is still, there, these still are really decent death metal songs, all things considered. They still have some of the qualities I like that I said earlier. It's just that comparatively, I think they're a bit less interesting than the start of this project, and they can get to be a bit too typical for me at times overall. But, that aside, I still do think that Planetary Clairvoyance is a really solid death metal release, and I could definitely understand the hype here with this project. While personally I don't think it's necessarily an album that's going to end up on my best of the year list or anything like that, I do still think that a lot of the ideas that the band brings to the table here on this project and the energy that they bring to it too makes for a really solid experience. If you're a fan of death metal music, you should definitely give this album a listen, because it's essentially just a nice modern take on this older style of the genre. So yeah, with that said, it's a good album. I definitely recommend it. Let's move on to the next release I want to cover, which is the newest EP from High on Fire, Bat Salad. Overall, I like High on Fire quite a bit, so I was interested to hear this new EP of theirs. There's only one original cut on this thing, the first song, the title track here, which is also an instrumental track. I think that it's a pretty solid instrumental, all things considered. Not one of the band's best instrumental compositions or anything like that, or not even one of the more interesting instrumental compositions that I've heard in recent memory, but it gets the job done nicely enough. You have some great riffs, you got some great soloing here, just some great instrument playing generally speaking. It's solid instrumental. Moving on though into the next 2 tracks on this project, they're both cover songs, and I think the first of these 2 covers, which is a cover of the Celtic Frost track Into the Crypts of Rays, is a pretty great cover, all things considered. I love the original track, and I think the High on Fire twist that's added to it works really nicely, because I like the very visceral, aggressive, in-your-face nature of the original track, and that's a quality that High on Fire also has, but it's a kind of different take on those qualities. I love the really gravelly vocals here on this track. I think they add a different taste than what was on the original song, but they still manage to sound fantastic. I love the really thick, pummeling sound of the instrumentation here on this track. Like I said before, I love the instrumentation on the original version of this track as well. I love how aggressive and dark it sounds, but this new take on it here is, equally aggressive and in your face, but in a very different way, like I said before. High on Fire really take this track and make it their own while still maintaining a lot of the qualities that made the song good to begin with. This EP concludes with a cover of the Bad Brains track, Don't Bother Me. Overall, I think it's a decent cover. I don't think it's anywhere near as good as the cover that precedes it, or even as good as the instrumental track that opens up this project. However, it's still pretty enjoyable. I think the band's having a ton of fun making this track. They all sound really nice on this thing as well. It's just not as standout as the cover that precedes it, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Overall, Bat Salad is a pretty decent addition to your High on Fire collection of music if you're a fan of the band. I really wouldn't recommend this to people unfamiliar with the group, just because it's kind of an odd place to start with their catalog, considering you essentially just have one instrumental track and 2 covers on this thing. But if you like this band already, if you've heard their other material, only at least some of it, then you should definitely have a good time with this EP. I don't think it's one of the best of the year or anything, but it's still enjoyable. Moving on though, the next project I want to talk about is the new EP from Lil Nas X, 7. It's kind of amazing that I've been able to go this far into the year without talking about Lil Nas X and Old Town Road yet, considering it's essentially been one of the biggest, if not the biggest thing to happen in music this year. It's not because I have a burning distaste for the song or anything. I really don't have much of a strong opinion on it. It's just because I didn't really have that strong opinion on it is why I never ended up talking about it. However, I did want to see this EP and what it had in store for me, just because I wanted to see if Lil Nas X really had much going for him outside of that track and the country trap sound he formulated for himself on that song. And coming into this EP, I expected many of the songs here to have that country trap sound. However, I was kind of surprised to see that that wasn't really the case. You have a lot of moments on this thing where Lil Nas X will just engage in some more straightforward, modern hip-hop sounds, and there will even be some moments on this EP where he brings in some influence from some rock music as well. As for the songs on this thing that do fall into that kind of country trap sound, of course you have Old Town Road and its remix with Billy Ray Cyrus on it. I think that these two tracks, as I kind of alluded to before, are pretty average songs. I don't really have much of a strong opinion on either version of the track. I will say that the remix version that comes sort of the start of this thing is probably the better of the two, just because I feel like it's a bit more fleshed out as a song. However, I still really just don't have much of a strong opinion on this song. I mean, it's kind of funny as like a meme track. It's kind of interesting that this song was able to accomplish what it did. It's just not a song that on its own really stands out to me all too much. I feel like the song Rodeo also brings in some of that country trap sound. However, I do feel like on this song, the hip-hop aspects do outnumber the country sounds by a good margin. I mean, you do have a Cardi B feature on this track with a pretty prominent role to it. Honestly, I don't really feel like this track is another one of the standouts on this thing either. I just think it's kind of forgettable. With some of the genre experimentation that goes on in the other songs on this thing, however, I do think that Lil Nas X is able to make some decent material at times. I think the track Panini is a pretty decent song. I think the hook on it is pretty solid. I mean, it's not one of the more memorable songs, I would say, overall that I've heard this year or anything, but it's not a bad song. And the song Family, You and Me that features Travis Barker on the drums is probably my favorite song on this entire project, bringing in this rock influence. I like the really driving beat on this track. I think the hook to this song is pretty catchy as well. Overall, like I said, not a song that I feel like is going to be one of my favorites of the year or anything, but still a pretty good song. However, I do feel like not every bit of genre experimentation that Lil Nas X engages with on this project ends up going over very well for me. I think the track Bring You Down, for example, which also features some rock influence, just doesn't really end up working all that nicely. I feel like he's going for this very grungy feel with this song, but it just kind of ends up feeling a bit lethargic and sleepy. The guitar on this track just feels kind of generic and Lil Nas X's vocals himself just sound kind of flat on this thing as well. You do also have some cuts on this thing like Kick It or Closure that I think are just, more straightforward hip-hop songs that just aren't super memorable or anything either. For the most part, I think that 7 is a pretty average listening experience. You do have some moments on this thing that are pretty decent, like Family and Panini, but at the same time you will also have some tracks where I feel like the experimentation just doesn't really end up working all that nicely. And overall, I do appreciate the fact that Lil Nas X has a lot of different sounds that he plays around with on this EP. I just feel like he doesn't really do any of them all that greatly. A part of me kind of wishes that he would pick one of these sounds and maybe focus and expand on it a bit more instead of just trying to do a whole bunch on one project. But all things considered, like I said before, I think this is a pretty average release. There's some enjoyable moments here, but a good portion of this project I feel is just kind of forgettable. So overall, if a lot of these sounds I described previously sound interesting to you, it's worth giving a listen, but if it doesn't sound interesting to you, I would probably avoid this one. Pretty mediocre release, at least for me personally. Moving on, the final project I'm going to be talking about here today is the newest EP from Planet Booty, Guilty Pleasure. I was introduced to these guys through a feature that they had on Tupperware Remix Parties Together Through Time that was released last year. I thought the track they collaborated together with Tupperware Remix Party on was a pretty great song. I liked what Planet Booty brought to that track, so when I saw that these guys had a new EP out this year, I was interested in checking it out and see what these guys could do on their own. I do know that these guys have some other releases under their belt in the past, but I have not listened to them as of yet. However, I'm definitely going to try to listen to those at some point in the future because I ended up liking this new EP of theirs quite a bit. On this project, the group is able to pull together this very upbeat, fun, synthy, funky collection of pop songs that are just a blast to listen to, really. The instrumentals for all these cuts are clearly inspired by a lot of 80s synth work as well as a lot of funk music too. They pull together into this really fun, upbeat instrumental package that I really enjoy. I think the vocals across this thing are really solid too, and the hooks on this album are insanely catchy too. Like, if there's one thing I'm taking away from listening to this EP, it's that Planet Booty could write a hook really, really well. I mean, it's something that they showcased on that collaborative track with Tupperware Remix Party that I mentioned before, but here on this thing, they really hammer it home because every cut on this thing has a standout hook that's been stuck in my head since first hearing this EP a few weeks back. And lyrically on this project, the band tends to have this pretty upbeat, fun feel to their lyrics too. It kind of reminds me a bit of the upbeatness of a band like Tupperware Remix Party, for example, but a lot of times on this thing they also fill it with some of the more sexual lyrics of maybe a band like Ninja Sex Party, minus the comedy aspect of that group, but they present it with this kind of, innocentness and goofiness that comes across kind of charming as opposed to maybe being a bit creepy or something like that. While the band isn't necessarily saying the most deep or interesting things on this EP for the most part, they managed to come across pretty likable with a lot of the lyrics here on this project. However, there are some moments in the lyrics of this project where the band does change things up a bit from the usual. For example, on the track They Say, the band decides to get a bit deeper with their lyrics and tackle some real-world issues. Particularly, it seems here on this track that they're talking about maybe like the older generation of people kind of looking down at the younger groups of people for what they're doing, and essentially kind of talking about things that they say, of course, hence why the title of the track is They Say. Particularly, I think on the second verse of the track in particular, it seems like the group may be talking about like the LGBTQ community in particular with some of the lyrics that they bring up here on this track. Also, towards the end of the song, they bring up things like pill addiction and things like that, and how essentially people need to help people that are struggling with these problems in order to rise above these things. Essentially, the band is able to, talk about these serious issues, but present it in a way that still fits in really nicely with the style that the band has introduced on the other songs on this EP. They still present it in this very upbeat and uplifting manner, but they're tackling serious subject matter. On the complete opposite end of the spectrum, however, you have the track Taco Tuesday, where the comedy influence that the band has kind of shown on some of the more upbeat aspects of their other songs comes to, the complete forefront of this track, as this song is literally about eating ass. I kid you not, this song is literally them comparing eating ass to a Taco Tuesday. That's what the song is about. It's absolutely ridiculous, it's absolutely crazy, but I think I love it for that reason alone. This is just a really fun track, and I also really appreciate how, at least instrumentally and vocally, it has one of the more unique deliveries out of any of the songs on this EP. So for the most part, I really enjoy most of what this EP has to offer. There are some minor problems I have with it, one of those being something that does relate to those couple of tracks I mentioned previously. While They Say and Taco Tuesday are probably two of my favorite songs on this entire EP, the fact that they kind of come back to back in the track listing is something I'm not really the biggest fan of, because, like I said before, one song is probably the most serious on the entire, album really, and then the second cut is the most silly. I mean, I like the fact that the band is able to write this variety of different styled songs, but I kind of wish that the serious and silly were kind of moved to opposite ends of the album, maybe, instead of being placed right next to each other, as it is kind of jarring going from They Say right into Taco Tuesday, because, like I said, the two songs couldn't be farther apart, lyrically speaking. Overall, though, I did find the majority of this EP to be a ton of fun to listen to. Like I said, the band has some great instrumentals here on this thing that are really funky, 80s inspired, just really upbeat, fun romp. I think the vocals on this thing are great as well. The songs on here are really catchy. The song concepts are, pretty interesting and cover a lot of ground as well. It's just a really solid, enjoyable EP. One that's definitely going to possibly make my best EPs of the year list come December or January, whenever I make that list. So yeah, if you haven't heard this EP yet and it sounds like something that'd be up your alley, definitely give it a listen, because it's a really enjoyable project. I'm definitely going to have to go back and listen to these guys' older material, because if it's anything like this new EP here, I'm definitely going to enjoy it. But with that said, that concludes today's catch-up review. If you guys happen to have any opinions on these albums or EPs different than my own, that's perfectly fine. In fact, feel free to leave them in the comment section down below. And while you're down there, make sure you also leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel for more music-related content, things like album reviews, track reviews, things of that sort. If you enjoy that kind of content, make sure you subscribe. Thank you guys for watching once again, and stay golden.